Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chats on the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we are delighted to have a very special guest. It is Laurie Pollard Johnson, who is a retired educator, a career writer, and now a novelist. We're delighted to have you, Laurie. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm great. And thank you so much for having me. I love talking about the craft of writing.
Oh, well, that's you. We are delighted that you could take the time to speak to us. So we wouldn't be here again, of course, without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland. Thanks for joining us, Laurie. The writing craft, that's one thing that, we definitely talk about it on the podcast here, but there's so much to talk about when it comes to the craft of writing that it never gets old. And I know that there's a topic specifically that we want to talk about today with you about heroes and villains and your sort of thinking around those. But, let's start off with you giving us some of your background and, about writing and what kind of stuff you write and how you sort of come about with this theory of yours that we're going to discuss.
Sure. Okay. Well, I got my start writing actually when my kids were in preschool and as swimming lessons. I had my notepad and I was writing nonfiction articles for periodicals, everything from Washington Wine Style to Bridal Connections and Sunset Magazine. And I had a particular love of the food and wine industry, not just because I got all these free dinners, which was wonderful, but because I met a lot of very interesting people who, of course, morphed into, to some extent, my books. And then I started selling my books, my children's books. And I was very fortunate to get into Perfection Learning Corporation. They chose two of my books, Truth Test and Recipe for a Rebel. And then they also included them in Accelerated Reader, which is a computerized program that's used actually internationally. I went back, I got a master's degree in writing, and that's actually where I began kind of investigating what I like to call story theory. What are the truisms? What are the tropes that stay constant regardless of the genre? And as part of my oral defense for my master's, I came up with this idea of this hero-villain dance. That is, that there's a predictable pattern of behavior between the heroes and the villains that propels and transforms the ordinary person into a hero through, of course, extraordinary circumstances.
Absolutely. Oh, the hero and villain dance is like, that's such an iconic thing. Sherlock and Moriarty, or
yeah.
So walk us through sort of how that works then, the hero villain dance and what that is between, especially as it pertains to the common patterns that you see.
Yes. Okay. Well, there's two parts to this that I think are kind of that lay the groundwork. The first is, and it's an Air Force quote. It says, it takes a great enemy to build a great plane. And so when you transport that into the idea of a hero, what that means is that the greater the villain, the greater the hero will become or rise to the occasion. The other one is to keep in mind that everyone is the hero of their own story. And that includes the villain. And if we can create a villain that is relatable by identifying what it is that how they perceive themselves as a hero, then we make them a lot more terrifying and a lot greater force to overcome. So that's where it kind of begins.
It's funny, I always think about comic books and it's like Marvel versus DC, and DC in some ways it's more compelling, but they're especially compelling because the bad guys are so interesting. I mean, honestly, Batman's kind of boring after you've but the villains, they're so interesting because they got such fascinating backstories, and yeah, you can relate to them. But in Marvel, Thanos, in that movie where you had it, everyone loved him because he was such a compelling villain.
Yes.
Yeah, that's always been the big criticism on DC. Is like they're overpowered. Like nobody has their heroes for sure don't have flaws usually, and the the villains are very very set as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It reminds me, actually, I got my start when I was teaching in the elementary schools before I went back and got my master's and moved to the college level. But one of the studies that I remember reading about was kindergartners, and they were given the choice, would you rather dress up as Big Bird, or would you rather dress up as Oscar the Grouch? 9 times out of 10, they said Oscar the Grouch, because villains are more interesting. We always have to be the Big Bird. We don't get to be the Grouch very often. So that is a lot of, I think, why we read fiction. We like to entertain these various ideas. Of course, we want the hero to win, and to become a hero. But it's fun to engage with those characters that are very, very flawed, yet also very relatable. I mean, or somewhat terrifying. I mean, when you think about Silence of the Lambs, you think about Hannibal Lecter, that's a very terrifying character. Why is he terrifying? Because he's smarter than us, right?
Yeah.
He understands psychology. And I think that's the key to the whole idea about this dance, is that the villain has to be more powerful in some way. It can be strength. I mean, David versus Goliath, right? That's a very, common trope. It can be intellectual, as with Silence of the Lambs. It can be based on a moral conviction, is what I would say that some have. For example, in the book No Country for Old Men, which of course was a movie as well, the also very terrifying villain in that has a moral conviction that what he says he's going to do, he's going to do. And of course, that plays out very poorly for some of the innocent people involved. So I think that it really has to do with, that villain being both relatable, but also terrifying in the way they approach their lives.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and who doesn't want to be the Grouch, right? I mean, honestly, just give us the permission to be grouchy. But yeah, I think that's always the key, is if you can make your villain relatable, and stop thinking of it as they're doing evil just to be evil, which never really makes sense, right? But as soon as you sort of give them, when writers sort of can show the perspective of the villain, and often, like in writing, you'll see that when they'll switch to their perspective in a chapter or whatever, and you can see what's going on in their head. And it's never just like, oh, I'm gonna go kill people because I love to kill people. I mean, it's generally like there's some reason, some wrong that was done to them, and that's overblown, and it's, or some flawed way of thinking. But that's sort of like, I guess in our own minds, we start to think, maybe that means there's this like very thin line between, somebody that we know going off and becoming a supervillain because something happens to them, right? And that's why I think it makes it so much more relatable.
Yeah. I mean, and when you think about, news programs, and they go into the neighborhood where they discover there's a bunch of bodies, in someone's backyard, and the first thing the neighbor says, oh, he's the greatest guy. He used to always bring the barbecue. And all of a sudden you get you see this look in their eyes like, oh my gosh, I came that close to the villain in my real life. And I think that that's a really powerful thing. I think also sometimes it helps to think about villains in terms of those, story types that they always talk about. Person versus self, person versus person, person versus nature, because it's very true what you're saying about this, archetypal, villain doing evil just to thwart the best intentions of the hero. That isn't what it's all about. Having a villain that is relatable and that is understandable. We understand why they're behaving the way that they are. And in fact, perhaps even find ourselves being attracted to them. Think of all the, James Bond movies, the femme fatale, or the hombre fatale, which is, they're very attractive people. We find ourselves being attracted to this person, and then we discover, oh my gosh, we were duped. That's very scary too, for people to be duped, to think that they don't have as fine a sense of, almost a radar of what's evil out there and what could harm us.
I mean, there's also when you have people who are quote unquote villains who people find attractive anyway. I was thinking of Luigi Mangione or something, who shot that CEO in the streets of New York, and there are women going bonkers for him.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, it's funny because that's the archetypal villain in probably more in older shows where they, or movies and stuff, where they always made the villain sort of ugly, or yeah, and I mean they'd still do it if you look at Harry Potter. Voldemort is not an attractive looking bad guy, right? But when you make them good looking, then that sort of like makes it harder, and then you're like, but bad people are supposed to be ugly, and then that means anybody could be bad.
Exactly. And that, I think, is what ratchets up tension in a book, in a story, and that is what makes us keep turning the page and keeps driving us. It acts like a motor almost, because we can't quite believe that this what is becoming on the page is what's real.
Yeah. Okay. So then, how does that interaction work? So you've built this villain, and you've made them relatable, and you've made them attractive. Like you've done all these things to build out the villain. Now, how does that interact with your hero?
Okay. Well, let's take an example of like a person versus self story. There's several good examples of that. Fight Club and Sophie's Choice, of course, are good examples of that. They're fighting either a moral dilemma, or they're fighting the issue of forgiveness, whether they can forgive themselves, as in the case of Sophie's Choice, which I'm still sorry that I saw that movie. It's kind of haunts you, doesn't it? I mean, she was really struggling. And of course, in the end, the only way to, rid herself of the villain, which is, the inability to forgive herself, is death of herself. Same thing with Fight Club, right? Same thing. He's fighting mental illness. One, though, that I think is really a good example is a piece of edgy young adult fiction called Monster. It's by Walter Dean Myers, who, of course, is a fantastic writer, but it's not a well-known story. But in it is first person, and in it, it's basically an individual struggling with his own sense of self. Is he truly a good person, or is he the monster that everyone is making him out to be? He is incarcerated for a crime that he isn't quite acknowledging. And so you see that, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, like the steps of a dance. Am I a good person? Here's the reasons why I think I am. Am I a bad person? Here's the reasons why everyone thinks I'm not. And that's a very interesting thing. Another, I think, example of that in like Person versus Nature is that it brings out the fact that nature doesn't have a sense of ethics aside from survival. And for example, Into the Wild, of course, the very sad story of Chris McCandless, profiles this young man. I think it makes a great example of story. Profiles this young man who was very idealistic, somewhat naive, I think somewhat sheltered, and he goes out to prove himself worthy of being completely independent, that he believes that he can be autonomous and live autonomously. And of course, this moral absolutism is tested fatally by nature. No one is able to live completely independently. We all have survived based on, what Einstein used to say, on the shoulders of the people before us, shoulders of giants. And that's very interesting. Another more classic example, I think, of Person versus Nature is The Martian by, I think,
Andy Weir, yes.
Yeah. And I believe that one was self-published to begin with, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. He wrote it out sort of chapter by chapter, and people went nuts for it.
Yeah, I read that book too. But this idea that, you have a completely hostile environment and you have to find a way to survive. And then, I keep thinking about the part where you think, okay, potatoes, I can grow potatoes. I can survive on potatoes, until the slingshot, aircraft that comes around, spacecraft. And then he gets this, Martian storm, and that wipes it out. And that is also a great example of how nature becomes the villain, or the environment, is that it keeps ratcheting up more and more challenging, more and more harsh experiences for the hero. And of course, at the end, we're all delighted when he survives. He's a true hero.
Absolutely. I love that scene at the end where he's sitting on the park bench, and it kind of puts it all into perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that villains aren't always other people, and that's there's a lot of movies where like you said, you're fighting against yourself, you're the villain, or your alter ego, or your mental illness, or your whatever is considered the villain in that story that you have to work against. And then environment, in the Martian, all that stuff. So it's not always like you're fighting against some murderer or wizard or that is a good good reminder. So then how I guess you've got to keep ratcheting it up, and then what way can you ensure that the resolution that you come to works, I guess, from both sides? I think sometimes, especially when you write a villain, or even in the case of where you're fighting against your own inner demons, right? It's not always about conquering that villain and vanquishing them completely. I mean, mental illness is something that you're going to always live with. You're not conquering it. You're finding a way to live with it, or finding a way to, have it, make it work more for you and be less debilitating, or whatever it is. With environment, you're not really conquering it. You're, again, learning to live with it. With somebody bad, even like with an actual person, a lot of times we see these villains these days. There's a lot of shows too where it's almost not so black and white anymore about who the villain is. Like, everybody in a show these days, I watch so many shows where almost everybody, the whole cast, is on this spectrum of good versus evil, and they're not really very clearly on one side or the other. And
Game of Thrones is a perfect example of that. Like, everyone is very morally gray.
Yeah, you're like, who's the good guy in this show? Who am I supposed to root for?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that there's actually a couple of really interesting points of that. The first is, that the idea of inner conflict, the idea that everybody has something that makes them a little bit weak, is really important there. When I think of, in popular culture, the movies, but you think of the Bruce Willis movies or the Tom Cruise movies, they're always, waking up in the opening scene, and they've got a frame that holds a picture of their wife and child who's either divorced and estranged or dead. And, there's a empty whiskey bottle next to them. And that kind of sets up this internal conflict, showing, this is a very flawed individual. And that, I think, is really the key, because when you take that inner conflict, and then the villain finds out what that is, or somehow manipulates that inner conflict. And then at some point, usually, and I'm going to draw from the Writer's Journey, Chris Vogler book, at that innermost cave, those two things come together, and finds a way to kind of heal both directions. The external conflict, which is the alien, or the bear, or whatever it is, or the serial killer, and then as well as his or her own inner demon to some extent. Series characters are a little bit different. I think that you have to have an ongoing arc, but then you have to have arcs within each of the stories as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's part of the hero's journey, isn't it? That you arrive at the same destination. Yes, you've killed the villain, but you've also changed fundamentally, and you're not who you were when you started. Yeah,
a little elevated. I think that's what a hero is, right? Ordinary person faced with extraordinary circumstances, becoming extraordinary as a result.
Now, you talk about the dance between the hero and the villain, and I find that such a fascinating thing, and that can be so compelling.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, again, I think that one of the most helpful ways to think about it is to think of these stories, and getting back to, what Craig had said about, you don't always vanquish the villain. And of course, I think that's something that is used a lot in television, particularly American television, where we have ongoing series. The costs of beginning a series is so expensive that they want to keep that going for as long as possible. And sometimes we end up losing interest. Walking Dead, I think, is a good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
But when you look at the story type of, the person versus society, and I would include, the government, the supernatural, destiny, that then you can see where that dance really plays out. I just recently read a book called The Measure by Nikki Ehrlich. Did you read that one?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I'm going to set it. I'll give you the little, the little 60-second, elevator pitch. But the idea is that on your 22nd birthday, that you find on your doorstep a box, and within that box is a string, and the string correlates directly to the amount of time you have left on Earth. It basically predicts your demise. So the question then, and as you see these various characters, and there's young characters, there's old characters, there's characters with very long strings, characters with short strings, and basically it develops this idea of, what would we do? And it really begs the question of destiny. Do we have control over our own destiny? Do we not? Regardless of how hard we try to change it, do we change anything in the end? And of course, she explores a variety of different ways, but that idea that destiny, every time you make a choice, I'm not going to open my boxes. I don't want to live by virtue of how long I have. Destiny says, oh yeah, well, guess what? You're still going to die young, and the person who says, you know what, I'm going to trade strings with somebody so that I can, join the military or whatever, because of course, in the book, if you have a short string, you're going to be denied entry into various fields of study.
Oh, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was one couple where the husband had, I think it was the husband decided he wanted to look, and the wife decided not. And of course, serendipity, and I don't want to be give any spoilers, but it just basically really begs the question of destiny. Every time they try to change something or try to address it and try to make it a decision based on what they wanted for their lives, destiny came, yep, no, don't think so, and so it went on and on and on with various characters throughout. Very interesting book.
That reminds me a bit of Final Destination, the movie, right? Where they see visions of their death, but then they change something to avoid it, but then it still ends up killing everybody who was supposed to die anyway. Right? Yeah. But in the story that you're describing, I was thinking to myself, okay, well then why don't you make your military up of everybody with really long strings, and then they're basically indestructible?
Well, that's exactly part of the story. And that, right. Okay, yeah, okay, Destiny says, yeah, no, we're not going to let you get, blown up by this bomb. We're going to make sure you hold out there. But it's a very interesting, it really spurred a lot of interesting, thoughts and comments and discussion in my book club. It's a very interesting book. Of course, another one, there's so many of, the person versus the government. Soylent Green, of course, one of the classics. A lot of sci-fi in that story type, but, one that's very topical is Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, what you were saying, Craig, about how the job is not to vanquish the villain, but to escape the villain altogether. That, of course, is what is addressed in the Handmaid's Tale. Now the movie or the television series is different, and again it goes back to that: what does American television do with a series?
Well, right, because the book ended, I think, after the first season or maybe the second season, but then they still wanted to keep it going, so they were basically writing it on their own. And
yes,
yeah,
and especially if they have a readership or watchership, I guess, viewership.
Right, exactly. If people want to see more, then you gotta. A lot of times they'll do that. They'll even movies, especially if they think it's a one-off, but then it does really well. But they killed the villain off, or even sometimes the hero off. They always find some way to bring them back. Like, oh, he wasn't really dead.
Yeah.
Walking Dead.
Well, yeah,
yes.
Walking Dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So when you were writing your books, is this something that you ensure to put in? I think your books are mysteries, right? So are you creating sort of the person who did the crime, and is there a dance between that? A lot of mysteries, it's solving a crime that's already been committed and you're not necessarily, I mean, yeah, you do at the end, sort of, usually at the end is the reveal, right? So if that's the case, then how would you do a hero villain dance if they're never really interacting until the very end?
Yeah, well, and I think that they just don't know that they are interacting with the villain yet. They don't know who the
That's true. That's true. It's usually somebody they know, the butler, and it's always the butler. And the butler yeah, that's true. They are interacting. They just don't realize that they're the villain.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really draws people into these locked room mysteries, where it has to be somebody because they're all on a ship, or they're all in a room, or they're all in the mansion or whatever. Somebody has to be responsible for this crime. But for me, in my own books, I look at it as the character is interviewing people with an eye toward not trusting anything that anyone says and double checking. And I guess that's actually what police work really does. They basically check everything that is being told, try to find some inconsistency, and then basically follow that path. And for me in Toxic Tort, which was my first cozy mystery, and that actually, I did self-publish that. It went really, really well. And then my publisher now said, you know what, let's give that another go, and wanted to reprint it. So that's it recently came out this last summer. But in Toxic Tort, I had my characters inner conflict is the fact she's very young. She's very inexperienced. All she knows is that if she can just get one good scoop on the Seattle, I think it's what I call it, the Seattle Tribune, then she can get on with that newspaper and she can be a real journalist. And so she takes it upon herself to interview all these chefs because she's trying to figure out who poisoned this very caustic restaurant critic. And she finds herself questioning a lot of chefs that have a lot of motivation to get rid of this person who is ruining careers. In Corpse in the Craftsman Cottage, that is the story of two best friends who are going through disastrous divorces, and they're single parents. So that's their inner conflict. They're trying very hard to make it on their own. All they want to do is they want to become independent. They don't want to have to rely on their ex-spouses. They want to be good mothers, etc. And the way that they decide to do this is to go into business together and flip houses. And of course, their first house, they discover that there's a corpse. And so then that sets off the events where they're trying to find out, who was the previous owner? How did they know about it? Could there have been somebody, a contractor who was hired to put this body behind this closet wall? And so it goes, and you never know who you can trust and who you can't.
Now, what about situations where you do know who the villain is and you have it's all like, I was thinking of the Joker and Batman and Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes. It's almost like the villain is kind of he's the mirror to the hero. And also in some cases, the villain is obsessed with the hero, and
Yes.
the Joker doesn't see himself existing without Batman. So where does it come into when you're unaware of who the villain is? You're very aware of who the villain is.
Yeah, I think that can be a very powerful trope. I'm thinking, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about Killing Eve. Have you seen that series?
Yeah,
fantastic story where there is that. It's hard to describe if it's love or mutual respect between the two characters of Eve, who is, I think she's FBI or something, and then of course, I can't remember her name right now. But I want to say Priscilla. That's not right, but she goes by a lot of different names. And how, there's this dance where, she comes so close to finding her and then trapping her, and then she moves off. And then there's these little tangents where she's finding out who is hiring her. And, and then the closer that she gets to her and the more relatable, the more it ratchets up the tension for us, because we're trying to figure out, well, who is, and I think Craig, you said this, who's right and who's wrong, and is anybody completely right, and who are we rooting for here, and and that brings up another thought too. Let's see, Orson Scott Card wrote a really excellent book. It's in Writer's Digest series called Character and Viewpoint, and in there he has this theory this model that he uses called MICE. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't.
I read that book many years ago. I mean, Orson Scott Card was one of my favorite authors growing up, and but yeah, it's been way too many years, so I don't remember much about it.
Yeah. Well, he calls it the MICE quotient, and he says that there are 4 types of stories: MICE, milieu, idea, character, or event. And when it comes to, you know, for example, the Killing Eve, you know, that's a milieu. You're really being basically immersed in this experience where you're trying to figure out who's good, who's bad. Another great example of this with a milieu story would be like The Sopranos, you know, and that's a television series, of course, and it's been a while since that's been on. But, you know, there are no likable characters in that storyline. I mean, everyone is bad. I mean, certainly I don't think any of their characters' actions are justified. However, at the very beginning scene, I don't know if you remember this at all, but the Tony Soprano, James Gandolfini, is at the very beginning, he is seeing these ducks in his pool, and he walks out to it. And I think it sets up the internal conflict. He doesn't think of himself as a bad guy. Maybe he isn't even really a bad guy, but he's stuck in this, you know, mafia system where you cannot escape. So the milieu is what draws us in, and we're willing to spend time with all these horrible characters because we're fascinated by this environment that they're all stuck in.
I like that.
And here's that book, by the way.
Yes, there it is.
I had it on my bookshelf back there. Yeah, you know, like characters is something that Orson Scott Card is like the master at, and you know, I remember reading that when I was first starting to write, and it was just, you know, really describes all that stuff really well. And yeah, you know, The Sopranos, I guess that's one of those examples where, yeah, everybody's a bad guy, but you still root for them because I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, I guess there's no one else to root for, but then, you know, they bring in like the police or the FBI trying to get them, and you're hoping they don't get them, right? Yeah. Maybe because you just want the show to go on. But but when I think about all those examples, you know, the Joker and Batman and Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes, there really is a dance between them that you can almost sort of visualize, that back and forth that they're always having. You know, they're yeah, like you said, maybe there's a mutual respect. There certainly is maybe between Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. I don't know as much about a mutual respect in Batman and Joker, but they're still so iconically, you know, always their back and forth is so pronounced in that, you know, and yeah, Killing Eve is another good example. Yeah, it's to me, and when you say hero villain dance, that's the kind of thing I think of. That's that sort of like constant back and forth between the hero and the villain. Yeah. It's very interesting.
Yeah. One I think is really interesting too is in the story type that it goes, you know, person versus, you know, technology or machine or, you know, aliens or whatever you want to say for that. Some entity that is, you know, vastly, I don't know if intellectual or intelligent than we are, but, you know, the idea of Jurassic Park. I mean, when I think of a fantastic story, a fantastic piece of speculative fiction, I think of Jurassic Park, the classic what if. What if we were able to just extract DNA from a piece of amber and, you know, you splice that into dinosaur DNA and create these dinosaurs? And now what we have is we have this villain of our own creation. Frankenstein is a good example of that, right? We created this. Now, how are we going to get out of it? And it kind of talks about the morality of, you know, the ethics of technology and of our own contribution to our own demise. But that's a really fascinating example too, to think about, you know, what happens when we go a little too far with our technology.
Well, and we're about to find out with AI, right?
That's what I was thinking immediately. I was like,
we're living the beginning of the Terminator franchise right now. And we've seen how that ends, but we're not stopping. We're just going to go ahead anyways, because, you know, we know how to beat it. We'll just watch the movies. But yeah, you're right. I think in a lot of cases, we are the architects of our own demise, and then it's like, okay, you've got to figure out how it is to kill your baby. The child that you created grew up and became this terrible person, and now you have to be the one to take it down.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
a powerful trope.
Yeah, 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think that's probably one of the most perfect examples. I mean, that had both the aliens who were these, supreme beings who basically put us into a human zoo, but then you also have the fact that Hal, because of the programming, that there's contradictions, and then of course assists the aliens in keeping us in this human zoo, and doesn't let Dave out.
That's
Yeah. Sometimes it's more of the villain pulling the marionette strings on the hero, and the hero doesn't even realize it. I think that's actually a very common trope where the hero keeps trying to do all these things, and the villain seems one step ahead. He's always the super villain. He's always got the massive brain. They never use it for good, always for evil. But yeah, and so it's always, you're trying to do this thing, and it turns out that was what he wanted to do all along, and you just fell into that trap. And then you have to think about how do I outthink someone who is planned five moves ahead, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's so satisfying when you read that or see it. I mean, I'm a big Star Wars nerd, and they just had the latest one with Thrawn, who's this blue guy, who's this super smart admiral, and he figures out a way to make the heroine think that she is, outsmarting him, but actually all the way along he's guided her towards this particular route. And it's satisfying when you get that denouement, and you're like, oh wow, that really is a twist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. My current work in progress is kind of addressing that same idea. And I actually hadn't thought about that until you just said that. But it's basically a story of a woman whose daughter dies very young. She's like 34 or something. And she doesn't choose to tell her mother prior to her death. And so when the mother gets to her apartment, she begins to see these notes that the girl has squirreled away. And by reading through these notes, she discovers why she wasn't told about the illness, etc. And that's kind of what you were talking about. And it's, of course, the daughter's not the villain, but the daughter is definitely causing the pain that she's experiencing because she didn't know, she didn't get to say goodbye. So the daughter has basically, she's a few steps ahead, having put all these notes out.
So where do you, in the eventual villains of your stories, because I know yours are sort of mystery, so you don't necessarily know who the villain is at the very beginning, where do you come up with this character? Do you start at like a mystery writer and start at the end and work your way backwards? Where does it all come from?
Well, for me, my stories, if they're children's, young adult, or mystery, always start with character, and it always starts with somebody usually that I have met, and I watch them, and I feel like I kind of know what their internal conflict is. And I'm actually a really big believer in, if you know the person's gender and their age, you pretty much know what their internal conflict is. And so I kind of use that to kind of create the characters. But in the case of Toxic Tort, it came from writing all the food and wine articles, and having met these amazing chefs who spend, sunrise to sundown, prepping and ordering and creating and cooking and teaching. And then on their days off, they go out and they feed the homeless, or they, teach people how to cook, nutritiously, and they write cookbooks. And it was so impressive to me. These are the most generous people I think I've ever met in my life, chefs. And I thought to myself, if a critic comes along from whatever intention they have and slams them, that can, destroy their career. They have to either change the name of the restaurant, or they have to go to another city. And I do know some of the chefs that, they lived and died on these reviews. And I thought, well, what if, you had this critic that was especially caustic and especially mean-spirited, and certainly didn't seem to see the value in any of these chefs work. And then, of course, you do discover that there's a motivation that he has toward the end. But, what would happen then with these chefs who are so, kind-spirited? What would it take to push them just over the edge, so they would do something as dastardly as poisoning somebody with chocolate?
I know, what a way to go.
Yeah, I can definitely think of worse ways. So what sort of advice would you give to authors that are trying to sort of work in a good balance of this hero villain dance into their own work?
It's interesting. I went to school in my master's program. We had a very, very well-respected horror group. And I remember a lot of them said, increase the body count. I don't think that really has to happen. Of course, writing cozies, all the violence takes place off page. Cozies doesn't have violence on the page. But I think what makes tension, or what creates tension in a book, in a story, is how ambiguous some of the characters are. When a character is flawed themselves and they're going about trying to figure out a way to solve this problem, to save the world, to save themselves, and then you have a villain, and it can be nature, it can be a very unrelenting environment, or just a lack of ground rules, as in like The Sopranos, for example, a completely different set of morality, or a completely different set of systems that organize their environment. That is very intriguing for people, and villains that are very relatable, that we find ourselves being attracted to. And we talked about being physically attracted to the person, like the femme fatale. That also engages us, because we're now invested in that character, and we want to see what happens with that character as well. And that's what I think really, really builds a good villain. Lots and lots of parallels to real people, and lots of things that surprise you. I think I'm thinking about that example of No Country for Old Men, where out of the blue, his violence is so predictable, yet such a surprise, because it's like, did not see that coming. I think that's what really works for people, to make their villains very much ingrained in us, that makes us want to keep turning the page. The scary villain is a villain that you're attracted to and that you get,
And sometimes I was thinking, I'm sorry I keep bringing up movies rather than books, but my favorite Marvel movie is Black Panther. And, the villain in that towards the end, you're like, low key, he's kind of got a point. And and that's I think that's always a fascinating thing to approach the villains, is where you're like, he's going around about it the wrong way, but he's kind of got a point.
Yeah. And of course, in American storytelling, I call it the Western story arc. We love anti-heroes. We love people who do the wrong thing for the right reason, and I think that engages people as well. Are they willing to, go a little bit beyond where they should be going in order to vanquish this enemy, or to, get to where they need to be?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's often those morality questions where, can you justify a small wrong to achieve a greater right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of the time what a villain at least claims to be trying to do. And then I guess it's often the hero who, it's hard to argue against wanting to stop that greater wrong. But usually their argument is there must be a different way than the wrong that you're trying to do to prevent the greater wrong. There's probably a better way to do it than doing either of those, right?
Yes.
And I think that's often sort of the back and forth is trying to figure out what that other way is, and sometimes it's convincing the villain that other way will work, and sometimes it's not. But I think that is a very common trope that we see.
Yeah, in the final minutes where the villain sees the error of his ways and turns to help undo his plan.
Right. Yeah.
And usually there's a time that will come out. They're given an opportunity to explain, well, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, I'm
Yeah, you always have that monologue, right?
Yeah, exactly. The monologue at the end. I'm thinking about a book that I just read recently too, called The Silent Patient by Michaelides. I don't know if you've read that one. Very interesting. If you want to talk about an example where you're not sure who the villain is and who the good guy is, and you think one way, and then you discover, oh, no, I guess we're wrong. That isn't the good guy. That's a great example.
I love that. Well, it looks like we are coming up to the top of the hour. This has been such a fascinating discussion there. We're going to, in a second, ask you to tell everyone where they can find out more about you. Before that, we're going to ask if Craig has any final questions. My question to you is, out of like popular villains that people might know, who is your favorite?
Well, one that we talked about, the character, and I wish I could remember what the character's name is, but in Killing Eve, I find that very fascinating. Really good one. There's also a short story that I read many, many years ago. It was actually, I used to teach creative writing at the college level, and I used this textbook, and it had it in there, the short story called I and I. And it was all about this person who they think they are, and then they find themselves in a situation where they have to acknowledge, oh yeah, maybe that's not who I am. And that's really fascinating to me as well. I think the things that make us really stand back and say, oh, maybe I'm not always the hero of my own story. Maybe I am the villain as well. But then of course in Killing Eve, she's completely unrepentant. She is completely
Villanelle, isn't that?
Yes.
Yes, I remember in the opening scenes of that where there's a little child eating ice cream and she like villainously just knocks it over. It's like
and she brings such a humanity to it too. I mean, you keep finding yourself wondering what happened to her when she was 8 years old.
Yeah. So there we go. That's a brilliant answer to that. So before we ask Laurie to direct everyone to her books, Craig, do you have any final questions?
No, I think that this was a really good discussion about heroes and villains, not just their dance, but just, what goes into creating these really memorable ones and all the different types of villains and heroes and, the different arcs they go through. So I think it's really helpful when you're writing because you always have to have conflict. And sometimes, somebody is thinking to themselves, well, this isn't that kind of story, it doesn't really have a bad guy. And it's helpful to remember that bad guy isn't always a person. It's not, it can be themselves. It can be their environment. There has to be some conflict. There has to be something that is, something that they're working against. Otherwise, the story is, otherwise it's our regular lives and we're all bored with those. So that's why we read.
Right.
So thanks for coming on and tell us all about where we can find you.
Oh, sure. Okay, so my latest two novels are from Wild Rose Press. You can go to Wild Rose Press and they have them there. They also, of course, have them up on Amazon in digital and in, or as an ebook rather, and as a print book. I also have a Facebook page that's dedicated Laurie Pollard Johnson Books. And then I write a variety of blogs and such for various writers, occasionally contributing to their websites. So usually if you put my name in, you'll find me.
Well, excellent. Well, we will obviously pop a link to your website right down in the description of this video. So if you have enjoyed what Laurie has had to say, scroll down there, click on that and go and check out her books. And while you are down there, you will see a big empty comment section. So please leave Laurie a comment and let her know how much you've enjoyed everything she has shared with us today. Leave Craig and I a comment. Let us know who your favorite villain is. There we go. Is it Negan? Is it Thanos? Who is it? Yes. I've got my villain here, my cat.
Yes.
And of course, if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and there's a little bell icon you can click, which will notify you every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked. And of course, there will be a brand new episode of Fully Booked next week. So until then, stay tuned.